What if I told you that the country that emerged victorious in two of the most catastrophic wars in human history, World War I and World War II, paid for its triumph not with gold or military superiority alone, but with financial ruin? That the nation once ruling over a quarter of the Earth's surface, whose currency once defined global trade, was left teetering on the edge of economic collapse by its own victories? It's easy to think of winners as those who walk away stronger. But for Britain, winning came at a staggering cost, one that reshaped its empire, its economy, and its very place in the world. This is the paradox of victory, how Britain won the wars and lost its wealth. To understand how this happened, we need to look beneath the surface of military strategy and into the vaults of banks, the chambers of parliament, and the smoke-filled rooms where debts were signed and futures mortgaged. Because in the shadows of victory parades, the pound was crumbling, and hardly anyone noticed until it was too late. Let's go back, before the bombs, before the trenches, to the moment Britain ruled the waves. In the 19th century, Britain was the world's unrivaled superpower. It had the largest empire, a dominant navy, and London was the beating heart of global finance. The British pound sterling wasn't just currency. It was a standard. Gold-backed, stable, and trusted, the pound was used for international trade, foreign investment, and colonial administration. Britain operated under the gold standard, meaning its currency was backed by and convertible into gold. This system kept inflation low, stabilized exchange rates, and gave Britain enormous credibility. Its financial system was sophisticated, underpinned by a network of banks, insurers, and financiers who could lend to governments and empires. And then 1914 happened. When World War I erupted, Britain assumed, like many others, that it would be a short war. But trench warfare dragged it out for 4 years, and the costs quickly spiraled. The government had two options: raise taxes massively or borrow heavily. It chose the latter. The first cracks began here. To fund the war, Britain suspended the gold standard in 1914 and began printing money. It sold war bonds to the public and borrowed extensively from the United States. Over the course of the war, British national debt increased tenfold. By 1918, Britain owed over $1 billion to the US alone, a staggering sum at the time. But worse than the debt itself was the change in global financial power. Before the war, Britain had been the world's largest creditor. After it, it was a debtor nation. The financial center of gravity was shifting from London to New York. Still, the war was won. Germany was defeated. Britain retained its empire. So perhaps it was worth it? Not quite. Winning the war had depleted not just the nation's coffers, but its long-term economic foundations. The economy had been warped for wartime production. Factories that once produced goods for export had been converted to make munitions. Trade had been disrupted. Shipping was lost to U-boats. Inflation soared. In a bid to restore confidence, Britain returned to the gold standard in 1925 under Chancellor Winston Churchill. But it was a catastrophic mistake. Here's why. During the war, the pound had fallen in value. But Churchill reinstated the gold standard at the pre-war exchange rate of 4.86 to the pound, far higher than the actual value. This overvalued pound made British exports expensive and uncompetitive, hurting industry and deepening unemployment. At the same time, the gold standard imposed tight limits on monetary policy. The Bank of England couldn't print money or cut interest rates to stimulate growth without risking its gold reserves. Deflation set in. The economy stagnated. By the late 1920s, Britain was locked in a trap: high unemployment, low growth, and political unrest. And then, the Great Depression hit in 1929. The global crash decimated trade. Britain, still shackled to the gold standard, couldn't respond effectively. By 1931, the pressure became unbearable, and Britain was forced off the gold standard again. The pound collapsed. The financial illusion of stability was shattered. Yet, again, this wasn't the breaking point. That would come a decade later. World War II. If the First World War strained the British economy, the Second nearly destroyed it. This time, Britain entered the war without the gold reserves or global dominance it had in 1914. It began borrowing from the very start, not just from the US, but internally, from its own citizens and from its empire. The total cost of World War II to Britain was estimated at over 20 billion, more than 200% of GDP at the time. To survive, Britain relied heavily on the United States Lend-Lease program, which provided war materials on credit. But this wasn't free. After the war, Britain would be required to repay or return much of the material and negotiate financial settlements. When the war ended in 1945, victory was again Britain's. But what remained of its economy? Britain was bankrupt. Its overseas investments had been sold to pay for war. Its industries were outdated and bomb-damaged. Its workforce was exhausted. Rationing continued well into the 1950s. And to make matters worse, the United States abruptly ended Lend-Lease in August 1945, demanding repayment and settlement. In desperation, Britain negotiated a massive loan from the U.S., $3.75 billion, plus an additional $1.25 billion from Canada. But the terms were harsh. Britain had to make the pound convertible to dollars by 1947, which exposed it to speculative attacks and forced another devaluation. In 1949, under immense pressure, the British government devalued the pound by 30%, from $4.03 to $2.80. This was a public admission. Britain could no longer pretend to be the world's banker. The empire, once the source of wealth and power, was now a liability. Maintaining control over distant colonies was expensive and politically untenable. The Suez Crisis in 1956 confirmed it. When Britain and France invaded Egypt to seize control of the Suez Canal, the U.S. refused to support them. Worse, it threatened to sell U.S. holdings of the pound, collapsing the currency if Britain didn't withdraw. Britain backed down. The message was clear. The empire was over. Financial dependence had geopolitical consequences. In the decades that followed, Britain tried multiple fixes: austerity, devaluations, wage and price controls, IMF bailouts. None restored the pre-war glory. The 1976 IMF crisis was a new low. Britain, once the world's financial leader, was now taking loans with strict conditions from an international body. So how does this all connect to today? Consider this. In 1914, Britain's national debt was 25% of GDP. By 1945, it was over 250%. Today, it hovers near 100% again and is rising. Like then, wars, this time figurative ones like COVID-19, energy crises, and inflation, are being fought with borrowed money. Central banks are printing currency, debt is ballooning, and once again, global financial power is shifting, from Washington to Beijing. The mechanisms look different, but the patterns, strikingly similar. A powerful country borrows massively during a crisis, devalues its currency, becomes dependent on foreign creditors, loses geopolitical leverage, and sees its global influence fade. And that brings us to 3 takeaways. First, victory has a price. Britain's military wins in the 20th century came with hidden economic costs that eroded its global status. Second, financial systems matter as much as firepower. The gold standard, wartime inflation, currency pegs, and debt management decisions all had long-term consequences that shaped Britain's fate. Third, empires fall not just from defeat, but from overextension. Maintaining global dominance is expensive. Borrowing to do it creates dependencies that eventually collapse. Here's the warning. We often measure power in missiles, GDP, or market size. But in history, real power lies in control over your financial future. Once you lose that, victories become Pyrrhic, and an open question lingers. Are we repeating this cycle now, globally? Are we watching another transfer of financial leadership, this time from the US to China, play out in real time? If history rhymes, as Mark Twain once suggested, then we would be wise to study Britain's story, because it teaches us that empires rarely die in battle, they die in banks. If this raised questions for you or challenged your assumptions, subscribe for deeper dives into the financial stories behind global power, and let me know in the comments. Which country do you think is next to pay the hidden cost of victory? Stay curious.